everyone. Welcome to this edition of Wine, Women, and Words. And joining me, as always, is Michelle.
Hello.
And I'm very excited about our guest this evening. We have Leigh Esposito here to talk to us about her book, The Godmother. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure. I'm about halfway through the book, so there's not going to be any spoilers in this episode. And for those who aren't familiar with the book, could you give us a little bit about it?
Sure. So The Godmother is an answer to a question I asked myself. What would a female Vito Corleone be if you also imagined her as a superhero and you also imagined her as the woman that you wanted to be? So The Godmother is a story of a woman who we open the book seeing her shrouded in mystery, like the mansion she lives in. People are coming to her house in a similar fashion to the beginning of The Godfather. In her case, it's her son's graduation from high school. And converging on her house also are women coming to her for help, also similar to The Godfather. We have an aging telenovela actress who's down on her luck. We have a young Cuban American psychic, among other people. And so why are they all converging here? And what are they asking for from this woman? Well, basically, she is a refuge for other women, but she's now about to be called on her own journey into herself by the young Cuban psychic who bears a message from beyond, from her aunt, who was also a Cuban psychic, who was close friends with the Godmother. And the message is essentially, it transpires, you need to go to Sicily together, you and the Godmother. So for the young Cuban psychic, her name is Isabel. This is very scary, but also aligned with the life of mysticism that she's lived in. She's not only a psychic, but a tarot reader. She reads caracoles, which are the seashells that people use for divination. And she's kind of like a mystical, spunky little kook. And then the Godmother is this elegant woman who we discover only wears white. She's erudite. She's circumspect. And she's not about to be going on some trip frivolously, but the stars align and she finds herself called as well. So the two of them go to Sicily together, and it's sort of like a mystery, a mix between a mafia movie, a mystery, a buddy comedy, an occult journey. And it's really a search for the Godmother's self, because she has this adopted front, and she in Sicily is forced to face the truth of her last name, which is a last name that she shares with the most notorious mafioso of all time. And she has leveraged that name for her power. And is she or is she not associated with this name and what it signifies? That's what we're all going to find out.
There's so many aspects of this book that I absolutely adore. And one of the first questions that came to me was the subject of the mafia, which all three of us have Sicilian heritage, so we know how much of a tricky subject that can be. And you broached it in a very unique way. Like, I personally, if it says anything to do with the mafia with it, I will run for the hills. I'm like, that book's not for me. But I like the way that you present it in the book, because it's not necessarily the female aspect of it. It's the almost like the friendship. It's the women supporting women. And can you really say that it's mafia when it's just a network of women supporting each other, if that makes sense?
Right. Well, so it's not, that aspect of it, women, I did you a favor, remember this someday, is not mafias. It would be organized crime. So it's like, it would have to be that there's a criminality, and people believe that there is with regard to the Godmother. And the reason that interested me is because that is something that, as a Sicilian American, I deal with all the time when I'm talking to non-Italians, which is, oh, you're part Sicilian. Is your family in the mafia? Pretty much, if I would say like 5% of my conversations with non-Italian people when I mention my heritage don't involve that question asked jokingly, which is not a question that we would feel comfortable asking to other identity groups as far as like seeking out their lowest common denominator association and asking them if that's part of their story. But I thought there's also this relationship that we have with the mafia as Italian Americans of sort of, not the mafia, with the Godfather, of sort of liking it secretly. But because it's the Godfather is a story of a very strategic man and his very strategic son. And there's something interesting about the power that they hold. All power. I mean, Diana, you've written about this in the context of dynasties that have been anointed by, being called monarchy and stuff, but all systems of power involve violence and corruption. And at the same time, to have your power as a group associated with the mafia, it's a lower system of power. It's like a guerrilla system of power. But there is something to leverage there. There is something that we have all kind of leveraged as Italian Americans. And that was what I wanted the Godmother to subvert. She took people's expectations and turned them back on those people and said, "You're afraid that I'm going to do this to you? Well, you should be," with an ellipsis afterwards.
And I love the fact that you brought up the whole, like, every non-Italians joking about being in the mafia, because I don't get it so much out here in California, but when I was back east, like, every time I turned around, there was that, "Oh, you're Italian, so there's somebody in the mafia, somebody related." Jokes about something falling off the back of a truck, and the idea that that your family couldn't have made it on their own. That kind of mentality. I don't know, did you ever get any of that, Michelle, when you were in New Jersey?
No. I was just trying to think about it, and I don't think if it had ever come up in conversation or like in a joking, jokes, it has been so infrequent enough that I can't remember it. Like it never stood out enough for me. So yeah, I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. But I'm also, I don't know. I don't think it's ever come up.
Maybe for me, I've never, until I started my Instagram journey, which my agent sent me on, I didn't have a lot of Italian American friends, even though I'm 100% Italian. I never grew up in an enclave or around a lot of Italian American people. Well, not never. Starting at age 12, that's when my family left the East Coast and we went to California. And after that began like a long time period during which I didn't have any Italian American friends, or if I did, then I would find out years later that they were like 10% Italian or something. And so I think my experience might have to do with speaking to people who don't know a lot about Italians.
And it's true. I think though there's that stereotype that keeps getting projected out there. I know for a while I was a vegetarian, and I told the client once I was a vegetarian, and I was working in the law office, just like, "Oh, just leave me alone. I gotta write this trust. Leave me alone." Yeah, I was like, "Yeah, I'm a vegetarian. I'm not interested in whatever cooking magazine you're talking about." And she was like, "Oh, well, you'd make a terrible Italian." And my hands was slammed on the table. I was like, "Excuse me?" And it was
so untrue too. Most Italians eat like beans and, vegetables is like the staple of the Italian diet.
Exactly. My mother used to tell a joke that if an Italian walks into a forest, they'll come out 10 pounds heavier. It's very true. I think most of my diet is fish and pasta. That's what I love. I sustain myself on.
Yeah. I mean, taking people's expectations of how you are going to show up and turning them inside out is sort of what I wanted from the Godmother in general, not just for Italian Americans, but also for the other. Well, first of all, for Sicily, which when I wrote the book, there was no White Lotus season 2. So the last time we had really heard from Sicily was, Malena or like Cinema Paradiso. There weren't a lot of stories coming out of Sicily, fictional stories. So I wanted to create this love affair with Sicily, describing the food and describing the people and the mysteriousness of the island. But I also wanted to show things that you wouldn't expect. You don't, in literature in America, most of the time you have an Italian American story. It involves all Italian Americans. It doesn't usually involve someone extremely identified with being Italian, sort of in the mix as just one ingredient, which is what you have here with the Cubans. And we have, a lot of like zany characters that don't all fit into one category. So that eclecticism is, you're probably getting the sense just from talking to me right now. I'm a very my interests are eclectic. I'm kind of an eclectic person. And the novel is just sort of a sandbox for me. Let's talk about jazz. Let's have them be in Sicily. Let's have there be tarot. Let's have there be like shady people, and one of my friends described, I have a male friend who's a producer, and he was like, this is just catnip for women. All the things.
It's true. It's true. The book very much is catnip, where in a lot of ways, the setting in Florida itself is a lot reminiscent of how I would picture Florida to be, and especially South Florida. I've only been to Miami once, and it was a brief trip there, but that's how I would picture this, South Florida to be. And I haven't quite gotten to, just shy of getting to Sicily itself, so I'll look forward to that portion of it. But that's having that in there. And you're right. I was thinking about it when you have, Italian Americans in the United States, that mix isn't quite there. I was like trying to thinking of like recent ones, even one that I'm working on. I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah. I think that part of that has to do with our story in America and how long, we're just kind of getting to the generations now where a lot of people are so dispersed. My parents are New Yorkers. They met at SUNY Geneseo. Their family, my parents are both 100% Italian. But then my brothers and my generation, our generation, and I'm third generation. So now we're intermixed throughout the country. What's interesting to me too is reclaiming what we lost through assimilation, which we understand why our families assimilated. If you look at the character of the country at the time and how unwelcoming it was to having to speaking other languages than English, or to staying among your group, which is something that we're working on now, is being able to not just tolerate but celebrate people continuing to retain their origin culture. But we did assimilate as Italian Americans, and we've lost some aspects of what it means to be Italian. And that's another sort of shadow in The Godmother, is this woman going back and finding out what the truth is of her family name, and confronting this town that her family's from in Sicily is sort of like a metaphor, inadvertent, for what a lot of us are going through right now in going back to Italy, Sicily, which we saw depicted in White Lotus when they go back to find their family. But also other people I'm talking to, my Egyptian friend, she's, been going to Egypt a lot to try to see what that's like. And, this idea that we can now be American and what we were or are genetically, sort of something else I was playing with in the book.
You said your parents were at SUNY Geneseo. That's over in the Syracuse area, correct?
It's a little north of it. Yeah, right around there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm from Utica. So right over. Our family's from the same area.
I'm like passionate about upstate New York. I'm extremely passionate. I love Syracuse, where my maternal grandparents are from. And a really wonderful Italian American community that's not, I don't think people know enough about the Italians of upstate New York. it's the downstate Italians take a lot of the stage, but the upstate Italians have such a gentle, like humble culture, I feel.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My family was all, they came to, they went straight to the Utica area. One branch was in Utica, the other branch was in Frankfurt, the Frankfurt area, just outside of it where the factories and everything were. So they were factory workers. They were longtime factory workers. I think, my grandfather did some, I don't want to say nefarious things, but they're like fun hijinks things. Like they would play, him and my uncle would wrestle to entertain the workers on their lunch breaks. And when one tired out, and because they were in a mask, one would tire out, he'd go back and they'd switch out and they'd go back and they'd wrestle. That was their thing. And what American during the Prohibition was not involved in alcohol running?
Oh, please.
Yeah.
I mean, weren't all the Italians making, I mean, I know my great grandfather was making wine in the basement of his house.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure most of the people in America were making some kind of alcohol in the basement of their house.
Exactly. So, I mean, you can't really, blame it on them, but they were just the Italian stories that I knew were hardworking immigrants trying to make their way in this country. And maybe some of the things were a little in the gray area from what we would consider now, but they were hardworking Americans is really what it came down to.
It's true. You also created Utica Greens up there in Utica.
Yeah,
thank you for
Utica
that.
Greens.
Thank you for Utica Greens.
Yes, and chicken riggies.
Chicken riggies. Oh my God. I'm going to Syracuse in a couple weeks to I take my son. My grandparents passed 2 years ago, so I was blessed to have them till I was 41. And this whole, as an Italian, like your ancestors are in everything, and now my grandparents are, past ancestors. So my son and I go to Syracuse. We're going to go every year for the orchard. We go to the orchards like we did with grandma and grandpa.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, we don't want to let those traditions go. And it's funny because I've come to realize from all, I spent 7 weeks out of the past year and change in Sicily. And you come to see like how much you're also American. So I went there and I'm like, oh yes, I belong here. I belong here. But then when I go to upstate New York, which obviously called our ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This really calls me too. I don't know what it is, like why that's the case, but we have a very rich braided history of I think the Italian American culture is just this very distinct thing, not super present in my book because my character is a first generation American and she doesn't really have a big group of family for the reason that her last name, nobody else has her last name. It's like the analogy is whose last name is Hitler anymore?
Yeah.
Has to be a last name that bad. So she and her parents are the only people with this last name. So she doesn't have a lot of family. She's raised in upstate New York, but she's living in Miami. And so there's not really an Italian American experience story here. It's more like it's more of a woman's journey to find herself, which is the journey that we must all walk alone. I don't know if everybody on this, are we all feeling that? Because I'm really feeling that at this point in my life.
Yes. And I mean, and speaking of the women of this book, and looking historically, because of course, a historical fiction nerd here is going to get all into the history of things.
Right.
I love the way they're depicted. I love the fact that of the relationships which we're going to get into in a moment here. But one of the things that the women reminded me of was an anecdote that I read I don't know if you read the book Living the Revolution.
No.
Oh, it's a fantastic book for those of you listening. If you have not picked up Living the Revolution, it is a nonfiction book about women or the Italian Americans during going from the Industrial Revolution forward and there's a story about Katie Stanton during women's rights where she came to an Italian American household and she was bad-mouthing the women. And later on, because I can't remember what person it was that was involved in the women's suffrage movement, but she never went into the kitchen. She never talked to the women. She was always with the men, and the women would get up and they'd go to the kitchen, which was a thing that Italian American women do. We go into the kitchen, and that's the world of the women. I was gonna say the cult of the women, but even still, you can go that route too, because that's where all the discussions went down. That's where all the political stuff went down. That's when decisions
Absolutely.
and life stories were made. And so that was reading the book. I was reminded of that moment where the women were doing things behind the scenes and building and fostering those relationships. And for character development side of things of that, because because we also talked a little bit about the different cultures that were going along. What was it like to be able to pull those characters together? Because Rafi, that is the godmother's name, correct?
Yes.
Okay, Rafi, and then we have Isabel. They're two completely different people, and you have so many different women that are popping up in there that were just, and I forget which one was the telenovela.
Oh, Marina.
Marina. They're all so different, but yet also unique. So let's talk a little bit about developing those characters.
So some of the characters were people that were drawn from life, such big people that they had to, this is my debut novel, so they had to show up because they just elbowed everybody else out of the way, and they were like, I'm a character, I'm a big character, I'm even bigger than you think. Living in Miami as I do now, I've encountered some very interesting women from the Spanish speaking diaspora. And there's a huge knowledge and practice of what we would call like the old ways or earth, all the different ways you could call it, but rituals that are very much rooted in our Southern Italian culture as well. But people don't really know them as much. That's my dog, Mickey. Mickey. That boy. People don't really talk about the old ways as much for Italians, I find. I mean, now I'm in a group of people who do, but so I had these women showing up in my environment who introduced me to traditions and practices and rituals that I then looked into our culture and realized they were there as well, and found people to seek that out. So the characters drawn from the people I knew from life were, very rich, and it was just for me to transcribe for them what they would do in these situations. Then some of the other characters, Clarissa Pinola Estes. Have you read Women Who Run with the Wolves?
Yes, I love that book so much.
How she says that every story, you're all the characters in the story. You're like the Bluebeard legend. Like you're the pirate who steals the maiden, and you're the old woman who tells her not to go, and you're this and you're that. So that's another thing is when we're writing, we later realize where we showed up in these characters and in these moments. So I feel like this being my first novel, what I started to do as the process unfolded and what ultimately came out by the end was just let the people do what they were going to do and show themselves to me. I didn't plot this in advance the way some people do and the way I might do for a next project. So the characters were almost born with all the pain and bloodshed that suggests. They're like ugly entry into the world, then they got a little more refined. Maybe there's a better way to do it next time. In fact, I was listening to your episode from last week. What is her name? She wrote Island Queen.
Vanessa Riley.
Vanessa, I love the things that she said. I'm totally going to try writing one third of the volume of my next novel in the first draft, because like her, I mean, I generated 145,000 word first draft. Well, she would write a 200,000 word first draft, but I think that it'll be interesting to see what character development is like for me for my next novel. And I'd love to talk to you too. I mean, Diana, you're drawing from life as well, and you have all kinds of background materials and things, and then just making up out of the historical record. So, but drawing a character, I feel like I don't even know if it's us who does it. Doesn't it feel like something does it through you, or I don't
Yeah,
even
I
know how to
think,
describe it.
yeah, I think in some cases there is that way. There's so many authors will be like, oh, the characters talk to me. I've heard that. Michelle, we've heard that how many times? I think if we had a nickel for every time that we heard it, we'd be rich by now. But that's a common phrase that so many
This would be
authors
much more expensive wine if that were the case.
But we've heard it so many times, and I do think that there is that element to it where we take and you know, whether it's a metaphysical thing where we're able to take in these characters, or if it's a writing what you know, which I know if you, Leigh, if you've listened to this before, you've heard me harp on it. You write what you know, and what you should know is people.
Mm-hmm.
And you take in these people and you create these, you know, algorithms of who they are, and you put them in your head, and you have these people that are living, breathing beings in your head. And maybe that does something on a spiritual plane that we just don't understand. God, I hope not, because some of them are going to show up at my door one day and I'm going to be like, I am sorry.
Some
Not
of them
really,
you
but
would
I'm
not
sorry.
invite to your fantasy dinner party.
Well, maybe writers and writing and the way this all manifests itself is just it might be some of the best evidence for this interconnectedness of the human consciousness, because it's almost like you plug in and then things come through you that must be there. I mean, if you're not, once you elect to plug in, which is what you're kind of doing as a writer, things come through you. Imagine if we were all plugging in all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Oh, sorry. I liked what you said earlier about figuring out where you appear in your story and in your characters. And I just think that's such an interesting point to consider, because even, you know, even if it's not intentional, even if you're not intentionally crafting characters off of people, you know, or off of yourself, all of a sudden, like at some point, whether it's like drafting or editing or rereading, you know, you'll have a moment where you're like, oh, there I am. That's me. And it could just be, you know, like a tick that the character does, or a habit, or a turn of a phrase where, you know, you're putting yourself in these pages, even if, you know, you're not a character speaking the words, you're translating yourself into the story in one way or another. And I think it's fun when you get the opportunity to find those moments and recognize them.
absolutely. I think it's, somebody asked me the other day something about Isabel, in our young Cupid psychic, and she's always hungry, and she's always rationalizing in her head why it's time to eat again, and she's excited, and she's naive, and she's not seeing the world, and yet she has this deep inner knowing and all these things. And somebody said, I understand, I think you're Rafi. That's what they said. I think you're Rafi, and I think this person's this, and I think who's Isabel? And I said, and I didn't even know this. I said, she's the other side of me, or something. I was just like, what? You know, and I never even thought of that before. But yes, like and it's of course like the character has all these things that I don't have, but a lot of the aspects, I think every character in this novel, and I've only written one, so I can't say what will happen for all of them, but I imagine it will be the case that every character in this novel does, as you're saying, have some of me. And I could probably find some, because how could we're the lens, we're our own experiential lens on the world, and then we're the, you know, the conduit for the book. I mean, how can we not, even if we were writing about the most abhorrent person, there has to be some, even if the us is the posture that we take when we look at that character, we have to be all over these things.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a little piece of us, I think, that goes into every little bit of the book. It's that our novels are horcruxes, to put it bluntly.
Yes. I love it.
Now I just have to write a whole bunch so that I'll just never die and I'll just keep writing books forever and ever and ever.
I love that you just said Horcrux. I feel so seen and known.
You are amongst two very, very nerdy
Oh,
people.
yes. Like
You are kind of
100%. This is like a safe space for all nerds.
I feel very safe here.
So back to the actual book topics of things, because there is one thing I do want to talk about is the research aspects of things.
Yes.
Because we always like to think that research is reserved for like the historical books or the nonfiction books, but even this would be considered contemporary. So there is a level of research that you did for this book.
Absolutely. Before emboldened by the fact that Mario Puzo had never spoken to a single mafioso or been to Italy when he wrote his book, I dared to write this novel's first draft without having been to Sicily, which is a fact that I thought about concealing. But then I thought, then Mario Puzo freed me. I was like, well, if he did it, then I can do it. So I spent time, when people walk through a city or whatever, and they're wearing a GoPro on their head, and you're like, well, who was going to watch that? That's ridiculous. I watched it. I watched it during COVID, and I watched people walk all through Taormina, which we now know from White Lotus, and watch them walk through Ortigia and through Palermo and all the places that I then went and spent a lot of time in. I was on FaceTime calls with my cousins in our ancestral town in Sicily, which I later visited, Lercara Fridi. And my cousin had me on FaceTime sitting in my own chair and with his whole little coffee clutch of old guys around with their little cupolas on. And like, it was amazing. It was so cool. And my Sicilian grandmother was still alive. So I would call her every day and talk to her. I was cooking recipes that were Sicilian, which we didn't really do. We really ate more Italian American cuisine, which is kind of like a mixture of everybody's best. Whereas I started to cook Sicilian dishes and listen to Sicilian music sung in Sicilian. So I got really deep with Sicily, Italy. I probably was sort of living as an Italian person in my house during COVID while I was generating this draft. But then also when something would come up, like the female saxophonist character, Dion, I thought it was really interesting. A female saxophonist. Why don't we hear about that more? I wondered if it was for the same reason my mom thwarted my saxophone career, which is that the reed can mess up your mouth and your teeth. So it's not like the way that a wind instrument player has to arrange their mouth is, not the best for aesthetics. I don't know if that's like what drove everyone out, but there's a female saxophonist called Melissa Aldana from Colombia who caught my attention. And I thought we should have a character based on her because she's sitting there holding the torch for all female saxophonists. She's the one, and she's a prodigy and she's huge. You should look her up. She's in her 30s. Really cool woman. But then I had to go down a rabbit hole of Ted Gioia's books on jazz. And I had to understand, I'm a jazz singer, but I don't understand how to describe jazz music because I don't have to read music. I don't have to read music to sing it, but I had to understand how does the saxophonist put their instrument on? How do saxophonists write music? What was the true origin of jazz? So we got into like New Orleans jazz, the fusion between sort of like an interplay between the Black community in New Orleans and the Sicilian community, which I did not know. I didn't know that the Sicilians were like a cool kind of, you would call them like the sidekick to the leader, which would be the Black community. But the Sicilians were like their right-hand guys there, generating jazz. And how did that start? Well, the blues. And I just get, like you both know, being nerds, you want, even, I don't even know what percentage of some of this research showed up in the book. Sometimes there'd be 3 lines within which hours of nerdiness were contained.
I understand. I feel that so much.
It's very ad hoc. It was ad hoc for me. I wasn't organized. It was a crime of passion, the generation of the first draft. And when I would get into something that had to happen, I would then become obsessive.
Mhm.
Again, I'm sure you can both relate. And I would get nuts on it for it. My writing took place from about 5 a.m. till 1 or 2 p.m.
Mhm.
And then all the evenings were reading and cooking.
Mhm.
And I had my son was with me, and he's now almost 10. But during COVID, he just, through some miracle, he was my little buddy. Like, he just put up with all this and sat by my side reading or doing iPad or playing with fidget toys and let me spend my evenings researching.
That's wonderful. I know I follow my husband around the house, like talking about all sorts of little like facts, like random facts. And he knows when I'm having an issue with a book because he's like, you're not like giving me random facts about the story. Is there something wrong?
We have not advanced past this particular obsession. Something must be stuck somewhere.
Totally.
We have our super serious
Scientific question.
scientific survey.
Oh, good.
Very
Ready.
serious part. This is,
Oh, yes.
you know,
So
this
serious.
is graded.
Okay. I'm ready.
Okay, so do you want me to do it? You do it. I'll do it.
I'll let you do it. I've been
Oh.
talking a lot this whole episode. I'll let you
You,
pick
you know, it's really funny because we can always kind of tell. I mean, we've been doing this podcast for 8 years now, almost 8 years. And we can tell when there are episodes that I'm totally going to be like, I'm so ready and I have like all my questions and I'm just like nerd girl, fangirl moment. And we know going in that there are episodes when Diana is there. And when that happens, we don't even like have to discuss it. We don't have to say anything. We just know and we step back and we let the other person just shine in
that's why
in their nerdiness.
You're my work wife. That's why we have such a good relationship.
But I've just been enjoying the conversation. Sometimes it's nice to just listen. But for the grade,
Right.
We have been talking to authors for a little over a year now about this, where the debate over plotting versus pantsing. I am not published yet, but I do have my 10-year manuscript behind me that I will eventually get to. And that was just sitting down and letting the characters decide what we're going to do today. There was no like zero preparation. But in the rest of the world, I have my lists and my color coding, and I like crossing things off my checklist, and I'm very organized. There's a stack of books right there that is driving me crazy. And Diana, on the flip side, she is very precise and organized in plotting her books, but she is okay with chaos. So we like to talk to our authors and see where they stand on in those categories as far as plotting versus pantsing, and okay with chaos, not so much okay with chaos.
Are we saying plotting versus pantsing? Like
Yes.
flying by the seat of our pants. Okay. I like that. Remember pantsing? Remember when it was pulling someone's pants down?
Yes.
I did say, I think a few episodes ago, that there should be another name for it, because saying like, oh yeah, I'm a total pantser, it just doesn't sound right sometimes if someone doesn't understand that pantsing is a literary term.
It kind of sounds like you're streaking through the quad, maybe. You don't know. Either way,
It conjures a different mental image.
So, I mean, so on this book that I just wrote, I had an idea for a book about a woman called the Godmother, who was a refuge for other women. And I thought, let me see what would happen if I started off on the framework of The Godfather with 3 people coming to her for help and see what happens. And so, you know, imposing that sort of like artificial little idea of a structure, from that, things blossomed. I started to have an idea once I was writing what might happen. And that started to blossom. And maybe around a third of the way through writing the book, I had an idea of some overarching things that I wanted to happen. The plotting that some of the editors that I worked with, like through getting the book ready to be sent out for queries, and then to get the book ready for submission when I went out on submission with my agent, some of the editors that I worked with were very shocked with the lack of plotting premeditation I had done. And I don't know if I'm able to plot things out in advance, but I think it probably depends on, I think that now that I've organized the chaos of having written a first draft without any idea of what was going to happen, I think I might sit down and think a little bit about what's going to happen in advance. But at the same time, sometimes what you want to happen in advance isn't what, and this is where the characters come in and mess up your whole, you know, masterpiece that you've created. Because what if you have this idea of what's going to happen, but the characters are unfolding and then they just don't do what you want? Disobedient characters, my friends. That's my answer. My answer is you can try to plot it, but there might be disobedient characters. I think it's like the Navy said, like, I think they say in the Navy, plan early, plan twice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with that. You could plan and then just have your plans messed up. But I kind of think that for me, it might not matter either way, because I am a Sagittarius. I'm a Sicilian and Neapolitan American Sagittarius woman. I could turn up anywhere. You know, I'm like just a person who delights in change and the unexpected. I think that we have to show up to our writing the way we feel comfortable doing so. I would probably not have written a novel if someone told me, before you sit down, you better write down everything that's going to happen. I would have been like, I'll see you later. I'm going to do something else. You know, but somebody else might say, oh, you have to just sit down and start writing. I can't write. I quit before I start. I need to know my plan. So I feel like, and I think that this whole notion that, you know, there's a part of your life where you're organized and there's a part that's chaotic. I think that that's 100% true. I think that we don't need to have control. We don't feel the need to have control over all areas of our lives. I think that some actions that we come to, we need to impose an order or we can't do it. And some, if we impose an order, we can't do it. And it's so specific to us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I can think of so many examples, like in my bedroom is pristine and my kitchen cabinets are crazy. And
and that's very true, because writing for my fiction writing is the one place where it's okay if I don't know what's going to happen. Like I don't have to have it planned out. But when you said that you delight in change, my immediate reaction to that is, oh, like that I do not delight in. Not necessarily. I'm okay with change as long as I know that it's coming. So if I can prepare for it, I'm okay. The unexpected, I don't handle that well. I have learned over the years.
We all have legal backgrounds, correct?
Just you two.
Just two of us. You were a paralegal, is that?
I was, yeah.
Yeah.
I did take one paralegal class. I took, yes, you 100% did. So I took, I think, like the intro to paralegal, like the very beginning one, and then I realized, like, how much trouble you could get into if you messed up a form. I was like, oh, that is too much pressure for me. No, thank you.
I agree. Paralegals are essentially the people who really practice law. They know when to file something, and they know, exactly what the form is supposed to be. And they know, they're like nurse practitioners. The nurse practitioner just like, get the doctor away so I can handle this. That's a paralegal. I was a lawyer, meaning I don't know how to practice law. I just
so true.
It's as simple as that. I don't even think I can improve upon that sentence. I don't know how to practice law.
You know the theories. You know how to do the upfront stuff. You were the ones that were there long hours and had to work weekends and stuff. But paralegals, so many of us were like, okay, 5 o'clock, time to go. Peace out.
That's when you really discover that you can't practice law, when you have like a late filing deadline and the paralegal's gone and you're just like shivering in a corner in the fetal position.
Exactly. And I didn't do litigation. I was I like contract law, I like intellectual property, and I did estate planning. That was my specialty, was estate planning. So yeah, at 5 o'clock I was just like, okay, bye, I'm out. I like rarely had to stay, and it was especially because we're dealing with so many elderly that they were, by 5 o'clock it was their bedtime. So
yeah,
I didn't have to worry.
That's the thing with me not being a lawyer, is that the lack of control you have over your life. I think your happiness in life has a lot of relationship to the measure of control you feel you have over it, which of course we don't. But at least when you sit down as a writer, or as somebody who is electing to do their job from a whole heart, that work that you put in, you're happy to put in. Or
100%.
Yeah, I mean, or like maybe not thrilled at the moment, but like it's part of your overarching integrity of the career that you're advancing. And so that's why eventually I went with the paralegals. I was like, bye, it's 5 o'clock forever, I'm leaving. So was that the question? Was the pantsing, the plotting or pantsing?
That was the very super serious scientific survey that we have.
You're so serious.
I think it was pantsing for me then. And what's the majority? What does everybody say?
I stopped taking note, like recording what they were about 6 months ago.
Shows how scientific this is.
I know. But it depends on the genre. That was the thing. The genre goes, like, contemporary and romance go either way. Historical fiction, the vast majority are plotters. Where so many of us, myself included, I had to be a plotter, and I like to think of plotting as more like guidelines. You can vary, there's nothing that you have to hold strict to. I think our mystery writers, a lot of the mystery ones are plotters, don't you think, Michelle? Or were they?
I would say, I would say the most pantsers would be in like fantasy, and some contemporary. I think that's where most of the pantsers came from, because fantasy, we can make our own rules.
Right.
My last book, I had to pants it because I did not plot it the way I should have. I just went with it. It was more of a wing and a prayer kind of thing. And I was having to do a rewrite, and I was pantsing so much of it. And Michelle was getting so many texts from me going, oh my God, what did I do to myself? How do you do this? I don't understand you pantsers at all whatsoever.
Well, I think I might switch camps to plotter when I'd like to write a sequel for the Godmother next, and that will be probably a little bit plotty, but I have a historical fiction novel that's forcing itself out that I think is going to be after that. And I can see why you would want to plot, because we know the general thing that happened to the person. So you have to figure out how to make it dramatic. Right. I mean, it can't just be like, then this, then this, then this. I mean, that's not how you did it, Diana.
Yeah. And then you also have to have, I love the way Laura Morelli put it, where you have to have your tent poles. And those are your
Yes.
dates. And you have to have those dates because there will be people who will email you and they will be like, oh, they weren't there on this date. Like if it's a specific person, they weren't there at this location on this date. How could you ruin this book and bring such shame to this person's memory by not having them where they're supposed to be on this specific date? And so those are things that you kind of have to take into consideration. And so I think because of that, you have to plot it out. That's what forces it.
Yeah. That how could you ruin the person's memory sounded like one of my old Italian aunts. like just like messing up a date, but it became disgracing an entire family. The stakes are high.
Oh yes. Well, I believe we've kept you, I think, for like a full hour. My
Pretty
goodness.
much.
Yeah.
You commandeered your night.
Yes. So
I was already ready for bed, so I could just hop right in after you were done with me.
there you go. There you go.
So if you would like to order your own copy of Godmother, be sure to check out our show notes. We'll have the link to our bookshop on bookshop.org. As always, bookshop.org supports our incredible writers. It supports the podcast, but most importantly, it supports all of the wonderful indie bookstores out there.
Well, Leigh, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be sure to have you back again.
Thank you both
Absolutely.
for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.